Hi, I'm Navidi Perera. I am a past captain of the English Debate Club of St. Bridget's Convent, and I am currently their junior coach. And I will be debriefing the motion this House would remove all statutes of limitations. This is the quarterfinals motion for Henley Debating Championship, and it comes with an Infoslide that should be mentioned in the description if you want to check that out. So how we'll go about this debrief is first we'll look into the definition of the statute of limitation according to the Infoslide. Secondly, we'll move on to propositions, burden setup, and potential arguments, and then oppositions, burden setup, counter setup, and potential argument. So firstly, on what is a statute of limitation. According to the Infoslide given by the ORCOM, the statute of limitation is the time limit for filing a lawsuit. These lawsuits don't include major grave crimes like war crimes or murder, but it does include a majority of crimes that are committed. So for the crimes that do have a statute of limitation, there is a limit to how late a crime can be filed for a lawsuit can be filed or prosecuted, right? After this period expires, you can't file a lawsuit for said crime. So moving on to proposition, I think when it comes to proposition, there is a strategic way in which you can define a statute of limitation that favors prop, right? Because one thing to note, apart from the fact that the limit itself varies depending on the crime, depending on the category of the crime, another thing that varies or is a little ambiguous is the triggering of the limitation period is also not absolute. That is to say, you can't exactly pinpoint to the trigger of the limitation period. You can't exactly say this is the start of the limitation period. This means that for some crimes, the trigger is when the crime is committed, but for some crimes, it's when the crime is realized. So on and so forth. The trigger of the crime is not absolute, and therefore there are slight inconsistencies when it comes to that. More on that later on. So for proposition's burden, it's fairly simple. Firstly, prop has to prove that the victim has a right to justice, regardless of whether or not justice is served immediately or justice is delayed. The victim has a right to justice. Secondly, prop has to protect the perception of the justice system. This is where you talk about things like public trust, the reverence of the justice system, and things like that. More elaboration later on. So moving on to that is the burden. Moving on to setup, 3 points of setup. Firstly, what is the role of legislature and court? This is important because legislature and court is what comes up and enforces a statute of limitation. They come up with the statute of limitation and they enforce it, right? So you have to understand where legislature and court exactly stands and what their role is in society. Firstly, these are the regulatory bodies that ensures that there is order in society. This is very important because when you have a regulatory body that establishes order in a civilized society, you need to have the public's trust. You need to have the public's trust to function effectively or efficiently within the society. So on a first level, the first role of the legislation court is to ensure that there is order. Secondly, this is where the role of the court is more tailored to the motion. You have to ensure that there is consistency in treatment of crimes. This is the importance of consistency. We'll check on that later on. But basically to say that consistency or like the equal treatment of each crime is one of the cornerstones of the justice system, and it has to be established and ensured that there is a proper consistency, because this is what protects each and every citizen's right to a fair trial. So we now know the role of the legislature and court, and this becomes important when we are talking about substantives. Secondly, one major thing you have to understand, second point of setup, is the mentality or like the psychology of the crime, the mental state, the psychology and the mental state of the victim. These victims, they're likely to be distraught and helpless, even if it's like a petty crime like robbery. If it was a large sum of money, these individuals are likely to feel helpless, right? Especially in cases like sexual assault, where these victims are very vulnerable. They have a shattered trust in society, and they have little to no self-belief or trust in themselves even. So this is where the justice system should ideally serve fair justice, and you have to understand where the victims are coming from, at the vulnerability of the victims themselves, right? Last point of setup then, on what exactly the statute of limitation is and why it's problematic. This is where you bring in the statute of limitations, and like you define it the way you can, the way you want to define it, the way you want to frame it, right? For me, as I previously mentioned, I would frame it as something that is a little inconsistent and a little ambiguous. Even if it's supposed to be fair and practical in theory, in practice it's often approached with like ambiguity, and it's often enforced with inconsistency, right? Not all cases are considered given the same equal treatment. Even if the crime is the same, they aren't treated equally. This shatters the sense of regularity in court, right? This is very important, because this is where people with influence get away with crime. More on that in my substantive, which will be moving on to my first substantive on how it dilutes credibility of the justice system. So this, I'll be talking about it in 3 major points. Firstly, on how there is injustice served by dismissing the psychological aspect of the victims, especially in trauma heavy crimes. Like we stated before, these victims are likely to be very vulnerable. Their mental states are absolutely shattered, right? So this is where the justice system is supposed to be lenient towards the victim and sort of give a little show a little leniency to say that this is a system that you can lean on. But more or less, a statute of limitation sort of undermines the moral legitimacy of the justice system. The justice system approaches these victims with a very immoral perspective, because they expect these victims to rebound very fast. It basically prefers people who are of sound mind and can function effectively, right? This sense of undermined moral legitimacy is a very bad look on the justice system. Secondly, justice itself becomes very exclusive. Like I mentioned before, if you are the accused and you have a lot of money and you're a wealthy individual, it's likely that you would delay the filing of these lawsuits as much as you can, right? This you can do with your influence, and you can delay it to the point at which you reach the expiration of the statute of limitation, where you can no longer view it as a legal lawsuit. So this again, justice becomes very exclusive towards people who have influence, towards people who have power. So the average person is deterred from filing lawsuits or even reporting crimes in the first place, because when you see victims of these crimes, when you see the people the loved ones, or like people who are close to these victims, when they see what they go through, they're obviously deterred from reporting the crime in the first place, because they don't have trust in that system, right? Lastly then, in society, in terms of this public trust, right? When you have a system in place that prevents people from reporting their crimes, this is where the public itself doesn't look up to the justice system, where they don't rely on the justice system to provide them with the closure that they need, because the justice system is actively turning people away at their most vulnerable states, right? So in this sense, the justice system itself won't be as revered anymore, and this is very problematic. The impacts of these substantives is it's going to be harder for the court to maintain control. When there's a multitude of people turning their back towards the court or having a lack of trust towards the court, obviously it's going to be harder to be taken seriously, to be given priority, right? They're not going to look at the court as a way of where you can go to attain justice. It's just going to be a corrupt system that is in place to sort of push you down further on, right? This secondly leads to victims, or like the families of the victims, seeking their own sense of justice, their own means of justice. This can look like theft, it can look like revenge killings, this also promotes vigilante behavior, and overall there's an increase in crime rates. This is sort of counterintuitive to what you actually want. You want a justice system that is firm, that is very effective, but overall you're getting increased crime rates simply because you let the public down and you don't have a system that is very effective overall, right? Second substantive then on how it inhibits justice. This I'll talk about in the perspective of the victim and the accused. As I stated before, the victim doesn't believe in this system, right? So there is no respect for legislature to be passed. So the system that was initially built to protect you eventually is what leads, eventually is what breaks you, right? This is where it leads to individuals in society being cornered, being feeling isolated, feeling helpless, right? Secondly, in the perspective of the accused, this is where realization of loopholes and exploitations of legal loopholes happen, right? This is where wealthy sex offenders pay off their victims' families or the victims for silence until they can get away with the crime scot-free. And this is where this cycle keeps on happening over and over again. On a second level, this gives birth to a wide array of organized crime, be it robbery, be it sexual assault, and things like that, right? If you are wealthy enough, you can get away with it. Then last substantive on how it doesn't uphold the rule of law. This is a minor substantive, and you can talk about how law is needed, and how consistency in terms of dealing with these court cases is very important, simply because the rule of law is, when it comes to the statute of limitation, these limitations, A, it unfairly favors the accused, and B, there's unequal access to the legal system, right? This effectively goes against the established rule of law. So in a way, this undermines predictability, it undermines transparency within the legal system itself, and it makes attaining justice a very ambiguous process. This is very bad in the perspective of the justice system, because this is where you sort of lose the leverage that you have over the public, that this is where you lose the civilized aspect of public, where you lose control as a civilized community, right? So in proposition, you can go about it in that way. Moving on to opposition, because we're running out of time. So firstly, on burden, opposition's burden is A, to prove that this the existence of statutes of limitation upholds efficiency in the system. Secondly, the burden is to prove that there is a right to a fair trial in the perspective of the accused, right? To put things into perspective, their opposition's counter setup would ideally be to characterize the statutes of limitations in a way that it is determined, to state that statutes of limitation that determined based off of the severity of the crime. Like a proposition has to concede to, each time duration varies depending on the crime that you're dealing with, right? So it's highly likely that these psychological considerations were made to a very large extent. The reason it might, basically to say that these considerations were already made. On a second level, this is to say that the justice system itself, the courts, they don't run on infinite resources and labor. So the court should be a reflection of the prevalent society. This sort of goes against having this infinite time period where you can report crime whenever you want. This comes to my third point of setup, where opposition can characterize crime as something that should be dealt with immediately. Why? A, to prevent faded evidence, and second, to increase legality and increase a sense of transparency, where the memories are still fresh in your mind and you're better able to have an effective and fair judgment, right? So that is how opposition can sort of warp the perception of the statute of limitation that proposition has already set. So moving on to potential arguments that op can bring up, the main idea of op arguments could ideally be, in my perspective, on how it establishes an effective justice system. You can talk about this in terms of resource allocation, in terms of how crime is dealt with, and the reverence the urgency that is given to reporting crime and things like that. So the first point under this effective justice system would ideally be to talk about the evidence. Evidence is provided, the evidence that is provided is very valid and timely. So this A takes less resources to make the evidence available in the perspective of the victim and the accused, and secondly, it also takes up less resources to process the evidence in terms of the court, right? And on another level, this is better for the integrity of the case. We know that this evidence is fresh, we know that it's reliable, and that the integrity of the case is not tampered with, it's not manipulated. This then leads to a fair adjudication, right? This means that the judge is able to base their decision of certified or proven acceptable evidence. Further on, this also prevents any sense of tampering of evidence, especially when there is more time. There is a higher likelihood that people destroy evidence, that people have faded memories, they sort of block the trauma from the get-go and things like that, right? So this prevents, this limitation prevents this from happening. It ensures that there is legality when it comes to the evidence that is presented in court. Another important aspect of an effective justice system is this increased urgency for reporting crime. This is important because now people give importance to how quickly you report the crime. That is important because that is when the court can effectively allocate resources to respond to these cases or these lawsuits, right? People won't use already committed crimes as blackmail for a extended period of time. This is where like families of victims or the victims themselves won't perpetuate this sense of fear or like manipulation on the accused, where they say, look, if you give me this sum of money, I won't report this crime to the court, or things like that, where there's continued blackmail. This sort of prevents that from happening. Lastly, the overall impact of this would be that you create a society where justice is served swiftly, where the court itself, the cases that are presented in court, is an accurate representation of what the society as of now is going through, what problems are most important at that there's relevant crimes being heard, or like relevant lawsuits being heard in court according to depending on what society looks like. Lastly, this also provides a proportionate punishment overall, because how the court process works is that they process verdicts based off of previous verdicts, right? So when you have a reliable system that ensures that they have credible evidence, that they have thought out or fair adjudication, where they have fair verdicts, this is where you sort of have a reliable system to fall on in terms of how you approach future lawsuits or future cases that are presented in court. This is very important because this is where you establish a very firm justice system, a reliable justice system. And at the end of the day, that is the burden of both sides, to ensure that justice is upheld, that the system itself doesn't fail the public, right? So that is my take on the motion, and thank you for listening.